Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's edition of the Public Engagement Series Talks from IISER Mohali. Before I introduce today's speaker, I have one request. Please hold all your questions till the end of the talk. Those colleagues who have joined us on Zoom can raise your hands at the end of the talk and we will let you ask your questions. Those colleagues who are joining us on YouTube, please use the chat box to type in your questions. We'll pick up your questions from there and we'll ask them for you. Okay, so today's speaker is Dr. Sabhlok. Dr. Sabhlok is an associate professor in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IISER Mohali. She's truly interdisciplinary. She did her bachelor's degree in architecture from the School of Planning and Architecture at Delhi. She then did a Master's of Science in Architecture from the Pennsylvania State University. Then she obtained her PhD working in the departments of Geography and Women's Studies at the Pennsylvania State University. She then continued to work as an assistant professor at the University of Louisville before joining IISER Mohali. Her research interests are very wide. She is interested in critical perspectives in disaster relief, gender and nationalism in the construction of border roads, and developing participatory action research tools. At IISER Mohali, Dr. Sabhlok has held various positions and has contributed immensely to the development of IISER Mohali. I had the pleasure of working with her as a warden. Both of us were wardens together a long time ago. She has been the head of the IISER Mohali Landscape Committee. A lot of the greenery that you see at IISER Mohali was planned and executed during her time. She's one of the first 4 signatories who proposed the establishment of the Eco Park of IISER Mohali. She has worked as the Dean of Students and helped the community during the very difficult pandemic times. She has been the head of the HSS department. And in all these places, her contributions are very, very significant. More than that, she is a person who is a great friend and a great sounding board for ideas and anything that you want to talk about. So I'm very happy to have Anu with us today. Dr. Sabhlok, it's yours.
Thank you, Prasad, for that really long introduction. It doesn't sound quite like me, but thank you so much. And thank you to everyone here for joining for today's presentation, taking out time from a Saturday morning to hear me out on this. Thanks to the outreach in IISER Mohali, again, Prasad and Amit and Mahua for organizing this. And with that, I will start. So as was indicated to me, this is more of a public engagement series. So what I intend to do is introduce you to the kind of work that I have engaged in and I continue to engage in, and what theoretical and empirical concerns drive my work. So it's in some ways it's not one research argument developed throughout the paper, but a sort of eclectic mix of my research journey before and after joining IISER Mohali. So with that, the title of my presentation is Feminism on the Road, Ethnographic Explorations of Gendered Infrastructures. And I know some of those words sound complex and perhaps loaded, but I will, kind of open that up as we progress in the talk. Okay, next. All right. So my journey has, as Prasad indicated, has been, I started off, I was trained as an architect, and both in my bachelor's and master's degrees in India and in the US. but somehow, and I really valued their education, but the questions that really fascinated me were about uh, not just about form or aesthetics of space, those were also important, but about people and about the social structures that construct space, about those who inhabit the space, about those who are shaped by that space, and those who construct that space. So those, and then oftentimes I would get to hear that this is not architecture, like you really need to focus more on uh, the form or the structure. And at that point I decided to move on into geography, and I now situate myself into this discipline, subdiscipline, that is called feminist geography. So what is feminist geography, right? And so as it basically, feminist geography draws from both the tools and theories developed by feminism through several decades and centuries, and geography, which basically understands life on earth, both from a physical geography perspective, that is to do with the rocks and rivers that you all studied in school, but also to do with an understanding of space as dynamic. And space, or to put it simply, spatial relationships. What is the difference? What is the relationship between inside and outside, between inside a home, between the kitchen and the living, like, very mundane also sometimes, but between local and global as scales, spatial scales that define our social political fabric. uh, So as a feminist geographer, some of the concerns that feminist geography has brought into the discipline are, one, about addressing the politics of knowledge production. As is explicit with the title, it started off with pointing out to the lack of women and gendered understanding of geographical knowledge. Also the very explicit lack of writings from women geographers. But it was also about not just setting up a binary between man, woman, or any kind of very strict binaries, but also feminist geography has emphasized a relational approach, and tried to understand how does, let's say, masculinity rest on understandings of femininity. So how different categories rely on each other, and how different categories are all mutually constituted. Feminist geographers have seriously attempted to understand power relations, particularly as they work through spaces and scales. And with scales, again, an example that I can, spaces I just explained, but scales, like what gets labeled as local, what gets labeled as regional, what gets labeled as national. Why is September 11 a global attack on terrorism, whereas a bombing in, let's say, Kashmir, a regional issue of politics? So, like, how do these labels then affect and work through geopolitics and power? Also, feminist geographers have been like, a commitment to social justice has been central to their work. And in questioning binaries, in questioning boundaries, in questioning established hierarchies, knowledge systems, feminist geography is a fundamentally unsettling discipline. It makes people uncomfortable. But we also think that in becoming uncomfortable lies the growth, right? However, it's not without its own challenges. For example, feminists are very concerned about establishing fields of care rather than, like, more competitive or more hierarchical structures. But when you are unsettling, when you're asking uncomfortable questions, then how do you actually also establish fields of care? So these have been the challenges that feminism and feminist geography have been facing, and which is why feminist geography, while it draws upon both geographic theory and feminist theory, it largely is a discipline in practice. And through practice, while relying on some of these fundamental theories, feminist geography has evolved over the years. Right. So what am I going to talk about today? I'm going to talk about my work on road construction workers and road as an infrastructure. But prior to that, I would like us to again introduce you to another moment in the social sciences. And as I mean, everyone is aware that there is so much building going on everywhere. There is, I mean, infrastructure is everywhere. You walk into the next street, you will see bricks being carried, you will see roads being built, you will see pipes being laid, you will see spaces being dug out. I mean, this is just everywhere. And therefore, social scientists have also taken note and started to really understand how infrastructures shape social life, and how certain kinds of infrastructures are made possible because of certain social structures, and what is not made possible, and what. So these are the kind of questions that are being asked in what is called the infrastructure turn in the social sciences. And the infrastructure turn in the social sciences also does not understand infrastructure as an artifact or as a static object, and instead infrastructures are seen as dynamic, as assemblages of ideas, of people, of material that come together, that circulate, and that form networks. And then it is these assemblages that structure social life in particular ways, that acts as sites for governance and administration, but then also as sites that lay the framework for social life, for social activity to go on. So it's within this general area that my work lies, my work on the roads in the Upper Himalayas. And in particular, I bring feminist theory into an understanding of infrastructures by pointing out and by bringing to the fore things like connections between material and symbolic aspects of infrastructure. And you will see that as my examples and my empirical notes from the field come forth. Down below this slide, I have images of there's this recent ad which was then taken down by Kent, which says, I don't know if it's visible because it's a small text, are you allowing your maid to knead atta dough by hand? It certainly is. There is a gender angle to it. There is a class hierarchy established. There's notions of purity which are then embedded with a class and a caste undertone, or in this case very clearly explicitly stated. As feminist geographers, we pay particular attention to the scale of the body, like the physical body itself, and including how particular bodies are able to construct infrastructures, other bodies are allowed to inhabit infrastructures, how do bodies experience infrastructures, what kind of emotions are generated as we both experience and imagine these infrastructures that are so everywhere. And so these are the connections that I make visible through my work with the road infrastructures in the Upper Himalayas. So now roads, I mean, roads is such a mundane, like this black ribbon made of tar. Like what can be significant about a road? And like what does, other than technical aspects of, how much tar or how much, rubble to use, like what are the kind of things one can look at with their understanding of a road. And here I just put up some signs. This very mundane object is actually associated with national development. So there is that imagery, there is that symbolism. Roads have always been associated with the notion of development. And places that have a road are considered better developed than those that might not have a pakka road. Also, considering the gender aspects, there is a lot of work that has happened on how people inhabit the road, who gets access to the road, whether vendors are allowed or not allowed, how safe are roads for women, who are the roads built for, is it the automobile, is it the pedestrian? I mean, all of these things are political. They are points for discussion, they are points that animate the social sciences. All right. So, what I have been doing for many years now, and sadly, since the 2017, I haven't been able to go for field work for several reasons. I mean, my own travels, COVID, other responsibilities. But for 6 years at least, every year I traveled. Every summer I traveled to the upper Himalayas, where road construction activity is going on at full swing. I mean, even now, the whole geopolitics of India and China and has created yet another flurry of road building activity. Now, remember I spoke about roads as or infrastructure as assemblages. Now, there is this material artifact, which is the road, but what all circulations has it enabled? I mean, obviously, there is the tourist, but then there is a whole lot of material, there is a whole lot of ideas about the road, meanings associated with the road, and the labor that comes in this case from Jharkhand to construct the roads. So every winter I have been going to Dumka district, Jharkhand, which is the prime supplier of the labor force required to construct these roads, and interviewing. So these are seasonal migrants who come every May to the border roads areas and work through till October, November, depending on the altitude that they're working at, and then return to their homes also in time for harvesting the rice, and then go on again to, let's say, more. I mean, so people go on to Andaman or to a private contractor in Goa or Hyderabad, and so those are the people I have been largely working with. Also have been speaking with BRO officials, GREF officials, and every year, every summer, my team has been different, and that has had a role in terms of what kinds of data am I able to access. So when I was accompanied by 4 summer students from IISER Mohali, they were all 4 boys, and it was a very different interaction with the laborers, where we had more access into their, let's say, living spaces, and I also felt more comfortable interacting. Other times I have had my own children accompany me because I had nowhere else to leave them. There is, in the center picture, is my son trying to learn how to break a rock. And at those times we have been welcomed by mostly it's men, but there are some very small number of families that have come to build the roads. Many of them are Nepalese, especially the families are more Nepalese. The single men are more from Dumka district in Jharkhand. So the point I'm trying to make is that this reflexiveness, that this, that how each time the field generates a different sense or a different set of empirical data. Yes, some things are consistent. The whole structure that involves the mate or the middleman, each one carrying 40 men, able-bodied men as a team that works in one road construction site, is consistent. The kind of contracts are consistent. Some of the embodied experiences of road construction are consistent, and yet the way we are told these stories and these narratives differs every time we have gone. In the picture below, we are at the BRO headquarters where recruitment is happening, and my first PhD student, Yogesh, he is helping them enter data into their computers. So it's also very participatory in the sense that we spend hours helping some of the laborers filling up their forms or learning how to use an ATM card. And at other times, like just hearing them out for a whole day to get an understanding of what life is like when you live, construct, and inhabit a border road that is under construction at the base of a mountain. So these are some of the things. More on this is on one of my blogs, which hasn't been updated more recently, but if anybody is interested, the link is down below. The the roads that we have studied are the Hindustan-Tibet Road and the Manali-Leh Highway. And the journey, the train journey that is required to come from Dumka is also highlighted on this map. It takes 3 days, and I will talk about it in my next few slides. All right, so coming back to the notion of gender and infrastructure, I want to draw our attention to, so I looked up a lot of online travelogues about Lahaul Spiti, about Ladakh, and I was very intrigued by the notion of how this area has been constructed as like nowhere land, as something which is like just pure nature waiting to be conquered, as roads less traveled. And there I knew that these lakhs of men and women have constructed the road, and that is what is enabling your travel on the road. I really wanted to write what I call a subaltern travelogue of this journey, of what is the journey like for people who construct the roads that we travel on. And that is the relationship that I wanted to draw quite clearly in my work. And here when I'm talking about the subaltern travelogue, I'm talking about the subordinate or the working class laboring bodies that are constructing the roads. I'm talking about those stories which become buried once the ribbon is cut on a glossy tar highway. And those are the memories that I wanted to highlight, which remain sadly missing even from the Border Roads Organization website themselves. And it's largely the uniformed forces. So Border Roads Organization is a semi-military engineering organization that constructs critical infrastructures in the bordering or troubled regions of India. And they do amazing work in terms of the quickness or the efficiency of their working to create infrastructure for the country. So the lower narrative I have from one of the thing quoted on a BRO website of the blood of men of the Border Roads Organization of India. Here again, I mean, I've seen Nepalese women, I've seen a very few Jharkhand families also being out, the children being out there working on the road, but a lot of it never gets mentioned in the narratives that circulate, which is why I think the idea of the subaltern travelogue is imperative. Also notions of conquering nature and its association with masculinity of, I am a man and I have the power to conquer nature, and the kind of images that circulate basically, perhaps subconsciously, but perhaps very consciously propagate that idea of masculinity, of manliness, of the association of conquering Mother Nature. Again, very, very gendered meanings, but associated with particular kinds of infrastructures. Some are very explicit. These are signs from the Border Roads Organization, yellow signs that anybody who's traveled on those roads will let him see, like, don't gossip, let him drive. What a gendered notion is made explicit in this particular sign. I mean, all of them, and these are just very few, and I picked up some of the these are supposedly the not so explicit ones. But the story that I want to tell is that of these men, and I mean, in the train, it's mostly men, but there are also women who I've met on the Border Roads construction sites. So on the left, you see a village from Dumka district in Jharkhand. And as you see, this is just before the return from the Border Road site. So these villages become like ghost towns or ghost villages where most of the able-bodied men and some women leave for elsewhere. And it's only the elderly, and in each family, perhaps one able-bodied person who is left, and children who is left to take care of them. A lot of this journey happens in these crowded trains. I've written about it more in the paper that I've cited below. But for me, what is also important is what is that experience of travel like? Remember the subaltern travelogue? What is that journey like? It is not that motorbike on which you have all the amenities that you require. I quote from one narrative. He says, the train was so crowded. Those of us who were sitting remained seated, and those who were standing we were standing for a 2-day journey. To go to the toilet, you had to yell out, and others would carry you above their head near the roof of the train. I mean, just imagine that. The smell of our sweat and urine filled the coach. I mean, this is a very physical, embodied, and emotional description of what that journey is like. And it's also a critique of the notion of development. Remember, these roads are being built for India's development and defense. But whose development? I mean, what about the development of those who are constructing these roads? How come they never accrue any capital? Like, what happens to their lives? And what is their experience of travel like? Those who make our travel comfortable. So these questions have really bothered me, and they really bother the workers themselves. I mean, the laborers have themselves spoken to me about, what is in social sciences high theory in terms of uneven development. The Jharkhand labor understand it very well. I mean, they talk about why is it that the Himachali government is building schools in every village, primary healthcare centers in every village. We are building roads in Himachal. What about Jharkhand? Why don't we have these there? So how the country's development rests on uneven development within the country is something that is very explicit through this study. I also visited recruitment camps. This is one in Nagrota. Hello?
I know. Yeah.
So where did you lose me? Because I was going on and on.
From Lakota, you said something like this is from Lakota or something?
Nagrota.
Nagrota. Okay, so let me first share my screen again. Is it visible?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Okay, so basically the recruitment camps are sites where the laborers end up, like about 10,000 of them were camping out there waiting to be recruited. And the wait itself, I argue in another one of my papers, is a space to test whether one obviously the able-bodiedness of the men was being tested through processes of health exam and exercises, but also what was being tested, I argue, is the docility or so anybody who protested was asked to was not recruited, not being told that you're not being recruited, but this is kind of how the narrative went, that we just require your body, we don't require your mind, you need to do the work and you do it as it's supposed to be done. And I found this waiting as both waste and I found this waiting as both productive of notions of development, of infrastructure, and of creating particular bodies for creating those infrastructures. Okay, now, how do I go to the next? Yeah. So, and a certain idea of masculinity gets produced in these camps. And in another one of my papers in Gender, Place and Culture, I have delved into this theme of masculinity because it kept coming up in the narratives that I gathered. The way the men that I interviewed were in Jharkhand, it was very different. They were like pretty much docile laboring bodies when they were at the recruitment camp or at the road construction sites. And I also found that the way the BRO discourse that surrounded them, that they're mostly Santhal or Pahadia tribes from the Santhal Paragana region, this Rumka district in Jharkhand. or they are Muslims. So this whole idea, especially around the tribal body, as this BRO officer tells me that they're strong and loyal, and because I asked him that, so what about all the dangers that constitute this work? Like what happens, what about injuries? He said, ma'am, nothing ever happens to them. So it's almost naturalized that there are certain bodies that are equipped, and like it's normal to make them do the work. From the mates who are the middlemen, I found that the masculinity of the same men was actually made more effeminate, in the sense that these are young people, they don't know how to take care of them. So I have to, like, so the mates keep the ATM cards with them. The mates kind of have a say in, even if the border roads organization tries to pay them a fair wage, a lot of it doesn't reach the people. It's the mate who is the middleman, and takes a lot of cut, and uses the discourse of that they are like my own children. I scold them, I take care of their finances, and I give them what they need to survive. This is not a very complex argument that I'm making over here, but for anybody interested, I've argued that there are many, so masculinity is not experienced in one way, and there are many ways of being a man, and a lot of that has a spatial aspect, and that is, I mean, you can read the paper from if you would like to know more about this, how I've developed this idea. I've also looked at, as a feminist geographer, paid serious attention to the body and to emotions of fear, danger in this paper in the EPW, and a couple of the narratives that give you a glimpse of that are. I mean, so the tents up. So if you imagine a road being constructed, and the so the mountain is here, and the tent is pitched right on the valley side of the road, and in each tent there are about 40 men who have just about enough space to sleep in the night, and depending on the weather there is either one more tent or it's outdoors, is where the cooking happens, and two of the laboring men are assigned to cook for the rest of them. But because there's blasting, there's drilling, there's any case landslides, there are a lot of casualties. So this idea that came from one of the narratives, that an army man dies only during a war, here we can die any day. So to me, like the idea that I've tried to develop is, we celebrate army men's bodies. We celebrate, they have contributed towards national defense, they have contributed towards national development. We also need to celebrate the laborer who puts in an immense contribution and is doing an equally, or if not more, dangerous work towards constructing these roads in the upper Himalayas. I mean, some of these are really high altitude areas, like 19,000 feet that I'm talking about. But also coming from how the laborers construct their own imagination of themselves. And oftentimes I was told to kind of stay on the side, drilling is dangerous, mountain rocks are ruse, it's a man's job, it's not for the faint-hearted, but they themselves will keep standing over there because they're a man. So that itself also was very intriguing to observe. And I've built some very, very good connections with them. In fact, a lot of my research drives from this one person telling me that this quote that I have used in several of my papers, मैं भी तो हिंदुस्तान हूँ, फिर मेरी हिफाजत कौन करेगा? So he was talking about security and defense and development, and Indian defense and Indian development. And I am also India. Who is there to defend and develop me? Because that is clearly not happening through this construction of the roads. I also looked at how the working men here in the upper Himalayas, who are very much entrenched in patriarchal notions of a gender division of labor, of caste, of each tribe having their own tola, which is a small settlement with a separate tube well back home in Jharkhand. But here, a lot of those structures end up not at least being visible. And I realized that a lot of that was to do with how they explained the same tasks that they had to do that they wouldn't do back home. Here they explained it as, in this narrative from Manoj, high altitude cooking is hard, washing clothes requires courage, bathing is impossible, the water is straight from the glacier, which is also very true. And yet you also see how narratives are constructed through through particular notions of a gender division of labor, through ideas of danger, through and how they are constructed differently in different spaces. So as a geographer, I'm also very interested in understanding that. Um, Homecoming is very, very interesting. So around October, when they're ready to come back home, most of them are like very dusty and dirty, haven't had a bath in ages, and they take a long train ride back home. But the moment they land, let's say in Asansol or somewhere close by, they will rent the fanciest looking taxi that they can find, take a dip in the nearest river that is there, wear new clothes, bring home tons of mithais, and be welcomed as heroes. And I saw a very, very different face of, I mean, the same docile men whom it was hard to make them speak were very different here. I mean, so about the BRO officer, for example, the same men were telling me in Jharkhand, कि अगर ये यहाँ पे होता तो हम उसको बताते, like how can he talk, because there was some other issues going on which I'm not elaborating here. Also how particular material objects acquire a gendered significance. In this case, this young man went out so that he's able to purchase a bike out of the money that he has saved. And a celebration, I mean, so while the national narrative doesn't celebrate them as heroes, at the local scale they certainly are the heroes, and they certainly see themselves as contributors to national development, and those who are making I mean, so many of them told me that you are able to travel because I have built the roads, and I feel proud to do that. And how this journey again makes them, like gives them a sense of transition from boyhood to manhood. This is a narrative from Janab. He says, I had run away from home to work in the BRO. He had just given his 10th boards and then left home to work for BRO. He said, before that, everyone treated me like a child, and now they see me as a man. So this is a coming of age journey also that you do to in order to be recognized as somebody worthy in that community. All right, so this is a very like a unnuanced, narrow version of the story that I have just told, but I've explored it in many different forms, and I have also explored it not just as a textual narrative, but through other more experiential or visual aspects. And that is, I mean, in order to reach out to different audiences. I mean, the poster on the left is from an exhibition that I co-worked with an artist and a photographer called The Road Chronicles, and Ode to the Laborer. This was a photo installation at the Alliance Française in Delhi. And here my idea was to bring to the fore connections between the middle and the upper classes in Delhi, the tourists. I mean, basically kind of build a relationship between those who travel as tourists and those who travel to construct the roads. I have also published in sources where one is which are more open to more artistic or creative imaginations about narrating the story. And in fact, we had an exhibition planned in Ladakh, which I really wanted to engage with the laborers through that exhibition, and then COVID stuck, so that has not yet happened. But some of the contradictions that emerged from so anytime you do a public engagement, such as now, I mean, it's very safe to write in theory or in a journal comparatively. But the moment you start a public engagement, you are fraught with contradictions. And some of that, and some of those dialogues, it's never clearly a victim violator story. It's never clearly, at least if you look at all the different spatial manifestations of it, in this context. And so a lot of contradictions kind of inhabit your work. And some of that I've tried to flush out in the paper in Geoforum that I've listed below. This was the same installation where I invited Naval Kishore, who was one of the laborers from Jharkhand, And he had written poetry titled Jharkhand Ke Majdoor, which in these very chic Alliance Française gallery we printed out. Um, and and he came, and then he was asked. So I was asked by the director of Alliance Française to talk about this work, and in that work I also invited Naval Kishore to talk about his engagement with the border roads, and he was very intrigued by this elite kind of reception about women drinking alcohol, about like, so it was a very different context for him. And after he spoke a little bit about the exhibition, he started reciting another poem on something about daru ke faide or alcohol, and that really totally created a uncomfortable environment in that Alliance Française. I mean, somehow I had to at some point like we kind of moved away from that. But in this paper I argue that you do need these uncomfortable moments, because it's very important for creating these moments of intersection, for creating these moments where dialogue can happen. And dialogue doesn't necessarily need to be very comforting, because it's only through discomfort that that evolution happens in some way. I'm using Prasad's language here. um, okay. So this is the different groups of students, family that have accompanied me through these journeys, and the funding sources. And I'm very thankful to each one for contributing different aspects to this project. And I want to end here with, so oftentimes as a feminist theorist and practitioner, I've been asked, especially let's say when I'm trying to do a discursive analysis of how masculinity is understood, or how it relies on other notions of femininity, or how gendered social relations construct particular spaces. I'm often asked, so what? Like, so why is this important? Why should we be concerned? Or what, like, okay, we understood that this is not something that we should be concerned about, but why is this important? All right. So now where did I lose you?
Just about 5 seconds ago,
All
five,
right.
10 seconds. Yeah.
Okay. So last slide, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. You're explaining why it was important. So what?
Yeah. So the so what question, is the screen visible now?
Yes.
All right. So what? So it's in my most recent project that I think some of the pragmatic implications of my work are coming together. And in some ways, it's also kind of tying my understanding of architecture, of space, and of feminist theory towards this project where, as a team, again, using a lot of feminist pedagogical methods, we are looking at creating for Abohar city and with Abohar city. Abohar is a small town with a 2 lakh population in the borders of Haryana, Punjab, and Rajasthan, and also India and Pakistan. Um, a more inclusive urban environment, a more sustainable urban environment. And we've only just started, so I won't be able to say what exactly we are doing. But we've started looking at small things like if in, I mean, through the narratives, what came out is that if in a shopping complex, for example, there is space for children to play and elderly and women or whoever to men to sit, then it becomes more inclusive. So small gestures like that, or creating spaces for vendors, looking at Abohar as a huge urban flooding problem. So we are seriously addressing the missing ponds from the city that have been filled up for development over the years. And so trying to take all of that through a very, very diverse set of team members, and bringing in both feminist theory and sustainable practices, and obviously an understanding of space and architecture into a real life project. So I'm going to end here, and thank you for listening to me, and I'm open to questions.
Thank you, Anu. So if there are any questions, all the people who are on Zoom, please feel free to raise your hand, and then you can ask your questions. By the time someone asks a question, Anu, maybe I will start off since I have the mic. So I found it very interesting about when you discussed how when you went with your students, you had a certain kind of access. If the students were males, you had certain kinds of access. When you went with children, you had a different kind of access. So can you tell me a little more about it? I mean, why does this happen? I mean, what do you think it is other than just feeling comfortable and uncomfortable? Is there something more to it?
I think very much. A lot of the kind of work that, I mean, ethnography by its very nature is about building a relation. I mean, it's relational. Uh, so depending on who you are able to build particular kinds of relations. So when I went with my children and in fact some of their friends, we were very nicely welcomed. And in fact, I have some long-term associations now with these Nepali families who also had young children. And so that allowed us to, an understanding of what is it like to bring up children on a road construction site, because we were welcomed into those kind of spaces. At another point where in fact, I mean, there have been some uncomfortable encounters also where I've gone with students and some or the other laborer have tried to like become over friendly, but then we have to stick together as a team. At other points, we thought that we will also camp next to the laborers, but so far it has not been possible for multiple reasons, which again, mostly social. So yeah, and if I go through the BRO, like there was one time when I visited the Rohtang tunnel construction site and we were housed in this very fancy guest house inside the BRO camp, and you have them accompany you. The labor talk to you very, very differently. So it's quite obvious. I mean, I think this is common sense, but why I wanted to emphasize it is that the data that I bring is not objective data. It is data which is very relational, and I think that is its strength, because it tells multiple stories. And life is about multiple stories, and social science is about multiple stories. Because the moment you try to build a linear narrative, it falls, it fails through.
Looks like I get to ask one more question because I don't see any hands up right now. So, road construction activity, as you said, happens everywhere all the time, right? And growing up in Bangalore, towards the later stages, closer to 2000s, right? I started to see that the labor composition which built the roads was changing. What was probably local was no longer local, right? So probably a lot of this bringing labor from other places or migrant laborers is happening all across the country. So are the experiences of people building border roads versus people other places, is there anything, I mean, do we know something at all?
Yeah, so Border Roads organization was formed in the 1960s, and initially, uh, uh, it was like the military would go into Dumka district, beat their drums, gather people around, recruit from there. They were hired as they were paid train fare. It was a very different process, and that set out a chain, a migratory chain. That still continues, even though none of those privileges of getting train fare and all of that exists. Now, why I say that, in terms of being different from other places, of course, there are chains in other places. But why I'm particularly intrigued by this particular aspect of road construction is that this is so much about national defense, right? These are critical roads for India's defense. And there are notions like I talked about in terms of conquering this very vast terrain of inhospitable land like Mother Nature. So here I'm able to explore notions of how those that are engaged in these particular projects are left outside that exact discourse of development or defense that they enable. Happens elsewhere also. Here it's very explicit. It also allows me to build upon ideas of masculinity, because it's not just any other road in front of a house or a urban area. It's about a particular site. Uh, and more importantly, like I said, a lot of feminist research builds from personal experiences. So how I got into this project was a family trip back in 2009, where I noticed children, men, women. Like I was climbing down a mountain with great care, and then I saw children rolling up and down, and like you suddenly see that relational aspect of with a particular site, yours and somebody else's. So basically, it's these nuances that really have captured my imagination. And it'll be, and different, I mean, and geographically speaking, different regions of the country have different pools of population, which have historically been set up as patterns in terms of circular migration. So, for example, Kerala might have more UP labor, or this might have more Jharkhand labor, uh, or another place might have more from Chhattisgarh. So those historical patterns are also very evident uh, based on which context you are studying.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Anu. Professor Gauri Shankar has a question.
Yes. Hello, Dr. Anu.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just I think Professor Prasad also asked a similar question. I just wanted to expand the sort of the notion of migration and labor and so on. So you've taken you've studied in great detail the road construction by the BRO, which by definition is in unpopulated terrain, and obviously all labor has to be migrant.
Right.
There. But if we look at migrant labor in other places, right, is it a phenomenon that has happened only in the last 20, 30 years? Does it reflect the uneven development across states itself? So, for example, so if you go to Chennai, it is said that more than 60% of the apartment security guards are from Bihar and Jharkhand, and if you come to the cities like Hyderabad, then rural families from the state, they actually migrate as families, but not people coming from the Hindi-speaking states.
Yeah.
So, what kinds of studies have been done on that? What is the underlying hypothesis for such migration?
Yeah. So there is a lot of work that has happened on migration. I mean, huge, from within geography, within sociology, economics, development studies. There is a lot of work that has happened on migration in across all of these disciplines, from sending regions, receiving regions, into understanding how the networks that enable this, like you said, what kind of regional patterns emerge. So yeah, there is, I mean, needless to say, there is tons and tons and tons on work on migration. In fact, it might as well be regarded as a sub-discipline in several disciplines, including in geography. Where I feel that not much work has happened is in relation to infrastructure studies, which is where I initially framed my work. Is that a lot of talk within infrastructure studies, especially now, has been about circulation of more ideas or ideological or more material in terms of the tar or the electricity, or all of that. But there is only very little work on the labor that enables this infrastructure development. And so for me, that was also critical, is in the infrastructure story, the labor story needs to be told. Um, and where else to do it than like an infrastructure that is highly celebrated, that is part of our national imagination of our defense and development.
Just one quick addendum to that. Is my belief true that this is a phenomenon that did not exist in the 70s and has happened only since then?
No. 1960s is when, so labor from Dumka has been migrating for ages. 1960s is when the border roads approaches them, and this labor migration pattern from there starts for the roads. Before that, it was plantation labor. It still is labor for the surrounding rice harvesting and sowing. So this has traditionally been a belt that has been where people have migrated for several things, and that itself has a very complicated history, which I'm not getting into over here. But patterns of migration have been inherent in the history of Dumka.
Thank you, Anu. There are two questions in the chat. I'll read them out one by one. One is, it says, you mentioned that men perceive themselves as heroes when they return to their village from work. How do their families perceive them?
As heroes. In the local area, so in the village itself, they're all perceived as heroes. There's a very warm welcome. In fact, when they're leaving, there's a huge sadness because, some of them do end up not returning. So when they come back, they are well, like how, again, in the gender, place and culture paper, I've cited how, let's say, an army man returns from a war. There are these celebratory Bollywood songs and all of that. So it's almost that kind of a celebration in the local village. But what I find missing is this contribution from the national narrative.
Okay. So second question is from Saundarya, who is on Zoom itself, but for some reason she can't raise her hand. Saundarya, can you unmute yourself and ask the question? Even if you can't raise your hand.
Hello, Dr. Sabhlok. My name is Saundarya. I'm joining in from Bangalore. Thank you for such a scintillating talk. It was really fun to listen to you. It would be really nice if I could hear a bit about what you learned about you said that it's predominantly male migration to the borderlands, but there are also a few women. So what is their experience? And also what about the women left behind in Dumka? Maybe something about that. Thank you.
So there are two categories, women coming from two regions that I have spoken with. Largely the women who work at the border road site are from Nepal, and the Nepali casual paid labor, as the BRO calls them, they mainly come as families, and they live in slightly more permanent housing than the Dumka labor. So they will have so what they do is that, let's say, they will take a tar barrel and flatten it out using a road roller and then construct a home out of that, in which a small family will live. And then both the husband and wife will work on the road construction site, and one of them will be carrying the child around as they work. This is very different from the Dumka experience. The Dumka, you will find between some 20,000 men, there will be one person who will have brought their family, mostly if it's a younger wife with no children. Then they will make a separate tent for themselves. Because remember, I mentioned that most of the Dumka men become in gangs. They're called gangs, led by the mate. So that makes it very difficult for somebody to come as a family. Back home in Jharkhand, the women also migrate locally. But then when the men in the family have gone away, then it's the women who are responsible for elder care, child care, fields, household, illnesses, so many different things. So that's a pretty tough experience. It's almost as much of a war front up there as it is in Dumka. The paper in GPC, I discussed that much more. Here again, it's a very, very nuanced and detailed story, which I've just given snippets of.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I'm just waiting to see if there are any other questions. Okay. I don't see any other hands up, and I don't see any other questions in the YouTube. So thank you, Dr. Sabhlok. That was a fantastic talk. Manjari has a comment. That was a very powerful talk, Anu. Okay, Nirali not able to raise my hand. I have a question. Oh, Nirali, please go ahead. Can you unmute yourself?
Hello.
Yeah,
Hi.
please.
Hi, I'm Nirali. I'm joining in from Ranchi. Thank you for such an enlightening talk, Dr. Sabhlok. It was very, very interesting to listen to you. I have a question in terms of understanding who are these mates that you mentioned in one of your slides, and how does the system work? Are these from Jharkhand itself, or are these someone appointed by the BRO? Like, how does this entire system of middlemen exists in this like the migratory system here? Do they help out migrant laborers in terms of like access to emergency funds or emergency healthcare or any of these things?
Yeah, thanks. This is again, it's yet another very complex story. The middlemen are mostly the smarter of the lot, who have, I mean, at least in terms of, like street smart. And so they end up, like they might have come as labor to begin with, and then they end up befriending the BRO officers. So every year, BRO sends out letters to several mates in Dumka, listing a certain number of people that they should bring along. So for those that have been identified as mates, they will receive this letter that bring 40 men along. And after that, the mate will do rounds of the villages, gather, the men in his team. The team is called a gang. Like these are all labor gangs. Then the mate takes care of all the food and the financial responsibilities and the travel until BRO recruits them. So he becomes this in-between person. And in lieu of that, I mean, his salary is very much similar to what the laborer gets. So he doesn't get that much extra from the BRO, but he ends up making a ton of money because whatever he spends on the labor through the process, and he will also leave 5,000-10,000 with the family because these men are going for 6 months. And then he will charge like 3 times that amount at the end. So that's the cut he receives from the laborers, the BRO pays unskilled labor 15,000-16,000 rupees, but that's not what they get, because at least like a large chunk of it goes to the mate. So that's kind of how the mate system works. He's part manager of the group. He's part a recruiter. He's like the in-between person between the BRO and the labor. He's also one of them. So whenever there is so they rely on him if there is a disaster. Somebody's asked a question about insurance, as I think Manjari's asked a question about insurance. So the BRO does offer reimbursement to anybody who has been injured on site, or like a certain amount of money to anybody who dies at work. That does not include if somebody dies outside work hours. So to access that money, the laborers rely on the mate to get it for them, which again at that point he gets a cut. So it's a pretty complex system which is put into place to make it more efficient, and yet it has kind of enhanced the exploitative aspects. And more recently, the Jharkhand government, when the Chinese conflict escalated this year, there were several special trains to be brought from Jharkhand, and the Jharkhand government insisted that this whole practice of mates be done away with, and like a more direct transfer starts happening. That has not, I mean, that has been put down on paper, and BRO agreed to several of the conditions, but I have heard that not much of it is being done in practice. The system of mates apparently still continues.
Okay, if there is anyone else who is not being able to raise their hands but wants to ask a question, just type your name in the chat box and I'll call upon you to ask questions. Manjari has a subsidiary question. Why is it only Jharkhand, or what determines this?
Basically, the uneven development. I mean, Jharkhand, several reasons. One, like I said, the historical Jharkhand, Dumka district in Jharkhand was one of the poorest, least developed areas at the time when this migratory pattern started. Second, if you look at it from the labor point of view, then, and every time I've asked them, it's basically access to cash. Most of the people that I've interviewed have like a small bit of land in which they can sustain themselves, but they don't have water to irrigate. So they do, and in order to get that water, they have to be into the part of the cash economy, that is pay somebody per hour for the tube well water. And therefore then health emergencies happen. Several reasons for which one needs an access to a cash economy, and this is one of the ways. Migration is one of the ways in which tribals and other residents of Dumka gain access to that cash economy. And yeah, so why Jharkhand? The reason is its relative position in the hierarchy of development in our country.
Okay. I think those are all the questions. So thank you, Dr. Sabhlok. That was a really fantastic talk. Really enjoyed it. I thank all of you for joining today. We look forward to having you back next time. Special thanks to Amit and Mahua, who manage all this behind the scenes without ever being seen. They refuse to be seen on the screen, in fact. So thank you both. Thank you, Anu. Thank you all. See you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining.